The Roman emperor who married his own horse and made it senator. The emperor and his horse. Hey guys. Tonight we're heading back to ancient Rome. So grab your blanket, settle into your pillow fort of existential dread, and let us talk about one of history's most confusing relationships between an emperor and his horse. Yes, his actual horse, not a metaphor, not a statue. A literal horse named Incitatus, who somehow ended up with his own marble palace, servants, jewelry, and a senate seat. Because if you're the emperor of Rome and your empire is already on fire, why not double down and make your horse a politician? Let us start with the man behind this questionable idea. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula. It means little boots. Cute, right? Until you realize the man wearing those boots would later demand the moon as a dinner guest. Caligula was born in 12 AD in a tent somewhere along the Rhine frontier, where his father, the celebrated general Germanicus, was stationed. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was from the prestigious Julian line, the same blood as Julius Caesar himself. So young Caligula wasn't just Roman royalty. He was practically a dynasty wrapped in baby armor. When soldiers saw the toddler running around camp wearing tiny replicas of their military sandals, they laughed and called him Little Boots. Caligula loved it. Later in life, he'd make sure no one was laughing anymore. Now, Caligula didn't have an easy childhood, which honestly might explain a lot. His father was adored by the people in the army, which of course made Emperor Tiberius, his adoptive grandfather, absolutely miserable. Because Rome had a rule: if someone was loved too much, they probably had to die. Germanicus died mysteriously in 19 AD, possibly poisoned. Agrippina accused Tiberius of orchestrating it, and in true Roman fashion, the entire family was slowly purged. By the time Caligula reached his teens, most of his relatives were either dead, exiled, or conveniently missing. So naturally, when Tiberius summoned him to live on the island of Capri, everyone assumed the boy wouldn't last a week. But somehow, he survived. He learned to smile, flatter, and quietly watch as Tiberius's court descended into paranoia and debauchery. Think of Capri as a luxury resort where everyone's on edge, like the world's most uncomfortable spa, hosted by a suspicious old man with too many wine cups and not enough morals. Caligula became the perfect student of power. He learned that cruelty could be dressed as ceremony, and madness could be mistaken for divine will. By the time Tiberius died in 37 AD, perhaps smothered by his own guards, or perhaps just exhausted from his own scandals, Caligula was ready to rule. Rome rejoiced. Finally, a young, charming descendant of the beloved Germanicus was taking the throne. The people cheered, the Senate applauded, and for a brief shining moment, everything seemed fine. Of course it wasn't. Let us float over to the early days of Caligula's reign, the calm before the breakdown. At first, he was generous. He released political prisoners, handed out bonuses to soldiers, and hosted games so extravagant that people genuinely believed the Golden Age had returned. But then, a few months later, he fell deathly ill. No one knows exactly what it was. Fever, epilepsy, poisoning, maybe even meningitis. Whatever it was, Caligula recovered physically. But the Rome that watched him rise started whispering that the man who came back wasn't quite the same. He became paranoid, suspicious, and, as ancient sources delight in telling us, a little bit unhinged. Now, it's important to say, Roman historians loved a good smear campaign. Writers like Suetonius and Cassius Dio painted Caligula as a monster, mostly because they were writing under later emperors who wanted to look sane by comparison. But even if half the stories are exaggerated, the truth underneath is still bizarre enough to make your eyebrows permanently tilted. And this brings us to the horse, Incitatus. The name means swift, which is a pretty standard racehorse flex. He was a tall white stallion, said to be one of Caligula's prized possessions from his chariot racing days. Rome loved the races almost as much as it loved gossip, and Caligula was both spectator and sponsor. He bet enormous sums, cheered obnoxiously, and turned the races into imperial pageantry. Incitatus quickly became more than just a horse. He became Caligula's statement piece. According to ancient accounts, Caligula had a marble stable built for him, with ivory mangers and purple blankets, purple being the imperial color reserved for emperors and gods. The horse had his own team of servants, a golden feeding trough, and daily feasts that included barley mixed with gold flakes. Because, of course, who doesn't like a little bling in their breakfast? When Incitatus was scheduled to race, Caligula would post guards around the stables to keep the horse from being disturbed. Neighbors who made noise were allegedly executed, which means somewhere in Rome a man might have lost his life because he sneezed too loudly near a horse. But here's where it gets weirder. The famous story is that Caligula tried to make his horse a consul, the highest political office in Rome after emperor. And everyone loves to picture a horse wearing a toga and stamping its hoof in the Senate. But modern historians think the truth might have been more of a performance, and a clever one. Caligula was constantly mocking the Senate, calling them lazy, corrupt, and cowardly. He once supposedly said, "If I can make a horse consul, it would do a better job than you." And then, because this was Caligula, he didn't stop at the joke. He built the props to match it. He held ceremonies where Incitatus was paraded in gold harnesses, servants bowed, and Caligula toasted to his horse's wisdom. It wasn't madness, it was mockery, a political middle finger wrapped in gold tassels. Still, not everyone saw the humor. When Caligula later gave the horse an official residence, and possibly even scheduled a day of consulship for the animal, senators began to panic. Because even as a joke, it was technically legal. If the emperor said it, it was law. The people, of course, found it hilarious. The Senate, not so much. They were being told that a literal horse had better morals, more dignity, and a cleaner record than they did. And honestly, he probably did. Ancient rumors say Caligula even hosted banquets where Incitatus was invited as a guest. The horse's food was sprinkled with opium to keep it calm during ceremonies. At one feast, Caligula reportedly lifted his wine cup and said, "If men fail me, beasts will rule." Everyone laughed nervously, because in Rome, not laughing could also get you killed. And when the laughter died down, the emperor whispered to his guards, "Do you see? They laugh because they know it's true." When a horse became the empire's joke and warning. So, where were we? Ah, yes, the banquets. Golden plates, purple drapes, a horse sitting in what was technically a Senate-approved chair, and an emperor who had stopped pretending to care what anyone thought. For Caligula, every public ceremony was theater, every insult was performance art, and every senator sitting through it was an unwilling actor in his cosmic comedy about power and hypocrisy. Now, before we roll our eyes and call him crazy, let's remember something. This was Rome. A place where emperors were gods, senators bribed priests, and entire armies would kill over the color of a chariot racing team. In that context, making a horse consul honestly wasn't the weirdest thing that ever happened. Still, it was effective. By the time Incitatus trotted through marble halls wearing bells and purple tassels, no one in the Senate dared question a single decree. Because if you can't argue with a horse, you sure can't argue with the man who owns it. Now, the people adored this absurdity. Common Romans, exhausted by years of corruption, found it hilarious that Caligula was mocking the Senate. He had turned the empire's most powerful men into background extras at a horse parade. But underneath the laughter was something darker, fear. Because while Caligula joked, people vanished. Those who laughed too loudly, or not loudly enough, were quietly removed. The emperor who began as a charming reformer now ruled through pure intimidation. Suetonius tells us that Caligula would sometimes invite senators to dinner, pour wine for them himself, and then casually mention the name of a recently executed guest, pausing just long enough to let the silence chew through everyone's appetite. "Don't worry," he'd say softly. "You're still alive. For now." It's not exactly a great vibe for a dinner party. Let us float over to the heart of Caligula's obsession with control, and how it tied back to his horse. To him, Incitatus wasn't just a beloved animal. He was the symbol of absolute authority. The horse didn't argue, didn't betray, didn't plot. Unlike senators, he was loyal without agenda. In a twisted way, Incitatus was Caligula's only honest companion, and Rome noticed. Imagine walking through the city and seeing marble statues of the emperor's horse, priests offering incense, and guards saluting an animal. It blurred the line between joke and religion, between mockery and madness. People whispered that the emperor was cursed, that his mind was poisoned by divine arrogance. But Caligula didn't care. He once declared, "Let them hate me so long as they fear me." It is the kind of line that looks great on a villain's poster, and terrible on a man with unlimited power. There's a story, probably exaggerated but too poetic to ignore, that Caligula once planned to appoint Incitatus as Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome. It's unclear whether that was a serious plan or just another late-night taunt toward the Senate. But the symbolism is the same. The sacred, the political, and the absurd were all collapsing into one. And that's really the essence of Caligula's reign. He wasn't simply mad. He was performing madness as domination. Every act of insanity was also a reminder. I can do this, and you can't stop me. The horse was the perfect metaphor. In a world ruled by corruption, what better insult than crowning a creature who couldn't speak, and showing that even silence was more dignified than senatorial speeches? Now, the story gets even stranger when we look at what modern historians have found. Archaeologists uncovered fragments of marble and inscriptions that suggest Incitatus's stable really did exist. Lavish, enormous, decorated like a villa. One tablet refers to the favored companion of Gaius Caesar, guardian of victory. So yes, the horse had an official title. And if you think about it, that's kind of adorable and horrifying at the same time. Like giving your cat a corporate job title. Except your cat's salary comes from imperial taxes. But here's where history turns quietly tragic. Caligula's obsession with control wasn't just over politics. It extended to life itself. He demanded that statues of gods be remodeled in his likeness, that temples be rededicated in his name, that citizens pray to him while facing the rising sun. He called himself Neos Helios, the new sun. And when he looked at his horse, he saw something purer than humanity, something that didn't lie or betray or beg. When people mocked him for feeding the animal gold-dusted oats, he replied, "Better he taste gold than those who steal it." The Senate didn't dare respond. They'd already seen what happened to those who did. Then came the famous Consul Day. Ancient accounts differ. Some say it was symbolic. Others claim it was an actual ceremony. But one morning Caligula entered the Senate, dressed in gold, leading Incitatus by the reins. He placed a wreath of laurel on the horse's head and announced, "Behold, Rome's most honest citizen." The senators froze. No one clapped. No one laughed. And that silence, that unbearable, suffocating silence, was Caligula's masterpiece. Because in that moment, the entire Roman elite realized the truth. They weren't just subjects. They were props in his living satire. The horse neighed softly, and Caligula smiled. Then, as if bored by the whole thing, he waved a hand and dismissed the Senate for the day. The empire went home humiliated. And Caligula? He went back to feed his horse opium-laced oats in a marble stable. Power, paranoia, and the price of a joke. After the great horse performance, Rome was officially in a state of quiet disbelief. The Senate was humiliated, the citizens were entertained, and Caligula seemed to exist in that perfect middle zone between comedy and tyranny. He was laughing, and everyone else was laughing too, just a little too carefully. But the thing about power is that it doesn't tolerate silence for long. Once everyone's afraid to tell you the truth, you start inventing your own. And Caligula, surrounded by gold, priests, and terrified yes-men, began to build a world entirely out of his imagination. He demanded temples built in his honor. Not small shrines, mind you, but marble monuments with priests and sacrifices. He renamed months after himself, forced senators to run beside his chariot, and at one point ordered the construction of a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae just so he could ride his horse back and forth, defeating Neptune. Because if you're going to declare war on a god, you might as well make it scenic. The horse, of course, came too. Incitatus, the imperial companion, now traveled in a custom-built barge with velvet floors and musicians to soothe him. Somewhere on that glittering sea, Caligula and his horse sailed together, the emperor shouting to the waves, "Behold, the Lord of the ocean walks where no man may swim." And honestly, you almost have to admire the commitment. Now, what's fascinating about Caligula is that he wasn't just being theatrical for fun. He understood spectacle as a tool. He had learned on Capri, under Tiberius, that fear works, but mockery lasts longer. A man terrified of you might plot against you. A man humiliated by you will never recover. And so, every stunt, every absurd display, from feeding gold to his horse to ordering the gods to kneel, was part of a larger performance. The emperor as the universe's joke teller. Except the joke always ended with someone dying. There's an eerie story that sums him up perfectly. One day, during a court session, Caligula was bored, which in ancient Rome was never a good sign. He asked one of the guards for a random prisoner from the waiting list of executions. The guard asked which one. Caligula shrugged and said, "It doesn't matter, they're all guilty." Then he turned back to his horse, stroked its mane, and whispered, "You see, at least you're innocent." That's a very different kind of justice system. Let's float over to the palace now, where luxury had long since turned into parody. By 40 AD, Caligula's estate looked less like a home and more like an ancient fever dream. Walls gilded with gold, fountains filled with wine, and corridors lined with mirrors so he could admire himself from every angle. At night, he wandered barefoot through the halls, talking to statues of gods and occasionally pausing to feed his horse by hand. Incitatus had his own servants, cooks, and yes, rumor has it, a flute player who performed lullabies so the horse could sleep soundly. It's the kind of detail you wish wasn't true, but ancient sources keep repeating it. And honestly, if anyone in history was dramatic enough to hire a professional horse musician, it was Caligula. Meanwhile, outside the palace, Rome was falling apart. Taxes soared, grain shipments were mismanaged, and soldiers were restless. But Caligula's inner world was sealed off by layers of gold and fear. He believed he was untouchable, a living god, immune to consequence. He even began referring to himself as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. To him, this wasn't arrogance, it was logic. He was descended from Augustus, divine by birth, blessed by Jupiter. The Senate existed only to nod and agree, and yet, deep down, the emperor who mocked everyone still felt mocked himself. He could humiliate senators, rewrite laws, even walk on water, but he couldn't make them love him. That, perhaps, is what truly broke him. Power without affection becomes poison. So he poured his loneliness into the only creature that didn't disappoint him. His horse didn't scheme, didn't flatter, didn't lie. It just existed. In a court of masks, that made Incitatus the only face he could trust. But as always in Roman politics, loyalty is a temporary illusion. Whispers began in the barracks. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, once adored Caligula, but now they grumbled over unpaid bonuses and unpredictable executions. The Senate, publicly submissive, secretly plotted. Even the palace slaves carried rumors from chamber to chamber. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time before something snapped. And if you want to know how unstable Rome was, consider this. People began praying for the horse. Not the emperor, the horse. Because if the horse lived, maybe Caligula would stay calm. And if something happened to the horse, well, gods help them all. One winter night in 41 AD, the inevitable arrived. Caligula was preparing for another performance, a festival to honor himself naturally, when members of the Praetorian Guard cornered him in a hallway. They stabbed him over and over so quickly that no one could even count the blows. According to legend, his last words were, "I still live," which, honestly, was very on brand for a man who thought death was beneath him. When the dust settled, the assassins ransacked the palace. Among the treasures they found, jewelry, statues, a few terrified servants, and a marble collar engraved with the words, "If men fail me, beasts will rule." No one could find the horse. That's where the story blurs into rumor. Some say Incitatus was killed by soldiers that same night, to erase the emperor's memory. Others whisper that loyal servants smuggled him away, hiding the animal somewhere north of Italy, then into Gaul. Centuries later, early French breeding records mention a divine white stallion of Roman blood, brought by unknown hands. Coincidence? Maybe. But then again, history loves irony. The empire had fallen quiet. Caligula was gone. But his horse, the symbol of his madness and mockery, lingered as a legend. A story that made emperors laugh nervously and senators squirm for generations. Because in the end, Caligula's joke lived longer than he did. He proved his point. Power is ridiculous, men are corrupt, and sometimes, the horse really is the better politician. The ghost of Caligula and the legacy of the horse. When Caligula fell beneath the daggers of his own guards, Rome breathed a sigh of relief that echoed through marble halls. The senators pretended to be shocked, of course. They wrung their hands, cried about the tragedy of a great emperor, and then, almost immediately, began fighting over who would replace him. Classic Senate behavior. But while men argued about power, something else lingered. A whisper, a rumor that the emperor's beloved horse, Incitatus, had escaped the blood-soaked palace. You see, Rome loved stories more than it loved truth, and within days, the story of the missing horse became bigger than the emperor's death itself. Some said the animal had been smuggled out through a secret tunnel beneath the Palatine Hill. Others claimed they saw it galloping through the Forum at dawn, white mane glinting in the first sunlight, like some divine omen, watching the empire it once ruled. Of course, no one knew for sure, but the Romans adored the idea that Caligula's spirit had somehow transferred into his horse. Because really, what could be more fitting for a man who wanted to rule as a god than to return as his own joke? Let's wander through the ruins of that imagination for a moment. The poet Juvenal later wrote that Rome, in those years, was obsessed with Caligula's memory, not because they loved him, but because they couldn't stop talking about him. He became a sort of bedtime horror story for senators. Behave, or you'll end up like the mad emperor. Parents warned their children not to lie, lest the spirit of Caligula's horse trample you in your dreams. It was weirdly comforting, in a way. Turning tyranny into myth made it easier to live with. People prefer their monsters when they're not real anymore. But here's where the story takes a quietly fascinating turn. And I promise, this isn't one of those dramatic lost relic theories. Archaeologists, centuries later, uncovered inscriptions near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon in France, describing a Roman noble family that kept a sacred line of imperial steeds. The wording was vague, but the dates matched the generation right after Caligula's reign. It even mentioned that the founding stallion was of divine favor and Eastern marble stables. Now, historians don't usually agree on much, but come on, that description screams Incitatus. So maybe, just maybe, Caligula's horse really did survive. Or at least his bloodline did. Imagine that. A Roman imperial horse, pampered by priests and perfumed by servants, quietly becoming the ancestor of France's racing stock. Not through conquest or empire, but through oats and breeding pens. If that isn't poetic justice, I don't know what is. Let's glide back to Rome for a moment. After Caligula's death, his uncle Claudius became emperor, the same Claudius who had spent most of his life being mocked for stuttering and hiding behind curtains during family dinners. He was the opposite of Caligula, quiet, bookish, and frankly tired of everyone's nonsense. When he took the throne, he ordered all traces of Caligula's reign erased, statues melted down, documents burned, names chiseled away from stone. But of course, erasing memory never works. The more Rome tried to forget, the more fascinated it became. And somewhere in that fascination, the story of the horse only grew. Writers began exaggerating it, because naturally they did. By the time the historian Suetonius wrote his Lives of the Caesars, the tale had already turned into full-blown satire. According to him, Caligula didn't just make his horse a consul. He threw banquets for it, invited guests to dine beside it, and even fed it oats mixed with gold flakes. Was any of that true? Maybe. Or maybe Suetonius was just being the ancient equivalent of a gossip blogger with a grudge. But here is what is interesting. Even the people who hated Caligula never denied that he was brilliant. Cruel, yes. Unstable, definitely. But smart. Too smart, maybe, for a world that wanted its emperors predictable. He used humor as a weapon. He used absurdity as a mirror, and by crowning his horse, he showed the Senate just how useless they were, that even a dumb animal could do their job better. 1,000 years later, philosophers still quoted that act as the sharpest political insult in history. So maybe he wasn't mad. Maybe he just didn't care anymore. Let's drift a little further into the centuries that followed. Medieval monks copying Roman texts in candlelit scriptoria would stumble upon Caligula's name and pause. You can almost imagine the sigh. Some wrote in the margins, "Mad Emperor." Others added small sketches of horses beside his name, as if even they couldn't resist the joke. And then came the Renaissance. Artists and scholars dug up Rome's past, and suddenly, Caligula was fashionable again. The ultimate cautionary tale about absolute power. Painters depicted him draped in purple silk, holding a laurel crown above a stallion's head. Poets romanticized his loneliness. Philosophers debated whether he'd been insane or simply too honest about human corruption. The horse, meanwhile, became a symbol, not just of madness, but of rebellion. A creature that stood silently against the empire's hypocrisy. Think about that. 2,000 years later, people were still talking about a horse that maybe never even got to eat those gold oats. Let's settle down for the closing thought of this night. When we think of emperors, we imagine glory, triumphs, statues, armies, and crowns. But Caligula's legacy is quieter. It's the sound of hooves echoing through marble corridors. It's the laughter that hides fear. It's the strange comfort of knowing that even in the highest palace, absurdity rules. Because the truth is, Caligula wasn't wrong about everything. Men are corrupt. Power is ridiculous. And sometimes, maybe the only honest thing left in Rome really was a horse eating oats in a marble stable. So, when someone calls him mad, I can't help but think, maybe he was just too tired to pretend anymore. Maybe, in his own twisted theatrical way, Caligula was telling the empire the same bedtime story we still whisper today. That civilization, for all its grandeur, is always just one step away from neighing. When Rome tried to forget. When the dust settled after Caligula's assassination, Rome did what Rome always did. It moved on. Or at least, it pretended to. The city had survived mad emperors before and would survive them again. And in the way of all bureaucracies, it began quietly rewriting the story, trimming the embarrassing bits, and polishing the marble face of history. The Senate officially declared Caligula's memory damnatio memoriae, literally, damned to be forgotten. His statues were torn down or melted, his name scratched off inscriptions, and his decrees voided. Officially, the emperor and his horse had never existed, which of course guaranteed that everyone would talk about them for centuries. You can almost hear the bureaucrats sighing as they filed away the paperwork. Erase him completely. And the scribes whispering, "Sure," right after we write down how to erase him. Because nothing vanishes faster than the thing people try hardest to forget. Let's glide through the marble ruins again. Somewhere in a villa outside Rome, a former palace servant named Marcellus kept a diary. Small wax tablets he hid behind a loose wall brick. It was found much later in pieces, but one line stood out. The horse was fed before the emperor was buried. That single sentence tells you everything about Rome's priorities. Even after Caligula's death, his household staff still treated Incitatus like royalty. They fed him with measured reverence, brushed his mane, kept his golden trough gleaming. Because what if someone found out they hadn't? No one wanted to offend the ghost of the man who once fed the Senate to lions, metaphorically and occasionally almost literally. For a while, Incitatus remained under quiet guard. Claudius, now emperor, didn't want the animal paraded around again, but he didn't want it killed either. So he ordered the horse retired, which was the Roman equivalent of being sent to a luxurious countryside villa to never be spoken of again. A gilded exile. Some said the horse stood in the sun all day, pawing the grass and waiting for a master who never returned. Others claimed it went mad, kicking at marble columns and refusing food until it starved. But Rome, as usual, chose the version that suited its taste. The tragic fable. The loyal animal outliving the mad god who loved him. It made a neater ending. Yet the story didn't die. Traveling merchants whispered it across provinces, in taverns, marketplaces, even temples. By the time the tale reached Egypt, Caligula's horse had grown wings. In Greece, it could talk. In Spain, it was immortal. You see how myth multiplies when truth disappears. People needed symbols, not facts. And a horse that mocked the Senate made for excellent bedtime gossip. Even Roman coins began to reflect the obsession. A few rare denarii from that era show a horse standing beside a laurel wreath. Probably just a generic design, but collectors swore it was the horse, the one with its own stable of marble and slaves. Funny, isn't it? How easily power turns into parody, and parody into legend. Let's drift ahead a few generations. By the time Nero came to power, yes, the fiddler, the actor, the man who thought Rome needed more firelight, Caligula had become almost a ghost story. Nero, who loved theatrics, reportedly kept a white stallion and named it Incitatus Reborn. Because of course he did. Why not double down on the family legacy of absurdity? Senators rolled their eyes. Commoners laughed. But deep down, the empire understood something very Roman. Chaos never really leaves. It just changes costumes. A few centuries later, as Rome crumbled under its own weight, the story of Caligula's horse still wandered through taverns and monasteries. Christian monks, eager to show how pagan emperors lost their minds, retold the tale as a moral warning. Behold, the ruler who worshipped beasts and was slain by men. They painted him as the ultimate cautionary figure, proof that arrogance leads to ruin. No mention, of course, of the political satire behind it all. Nuance doesn't survive well in theology, but one Benedictine chronicle from the 9th century tells something oddly specific. A white stallion was seen in Gaul, marked upon its neck with gems and letters unknown. Now maybe that was just poetic flair. Or maybe, and I like to imagine this, somewhere in the quiet valleys of what became France, a descendant of Incitatus really did roam. No gold, no marble, just a faint echo of imperial arrogance carried in its blood. Let's linger on that image for a moment. Because this, I think, is what makes Caligula's story strangely timeless. It's not about madness, it's about theater. He ruled like a playwright who knew the audience was booing but decided to keep performing anyway. And in crowning his horse, he revealed something about power that hasn't changed in 2,000 years. That authority often disguises itself in absurdity. That sometimes the joke is the truth. That the line between ruling and performing is very, very thin. It's why the story still feels modern. Every empire has its Caligula. Every government has its horse in the Senate. We just call them by different names now. Toward the end of the 5th century, as Rome finally fell to barbarian invasions, one last chronicler wrote, "They say the spirit of Caligula wanders with his horse, mocking the ruins of his empire. The laughter of the mad echoes longer than the sermons of the wise. That's the real legacy, not the marble, not the crowns, not even the madness, but the laughter. A tired, ironic, world-weary kind of laughter. The kind that says, yes, this is ridiculous, but what isn't? And somewhere, if you listen closely, maybe you can still hear the faint clatter of hooves on marble, a reminder that Rome once crowned a horse to prove a point. Not because it was crazy, but because deep down, it knew it was already halfway there. When the horse became a symbol. By the early Middle Ages, the Roman Empire was gone, but its ghosts lingered in the corners of old monasteries and fading manuscripts. Monks, tucked away in cold stone scriptoria, kept copying the ancient stories. Some for faith, some for fascination, some because they were bored and the winters were long. And among the endless pages of saints, emperors, and martyrs, there he was, Caligula. Always Caligula, the mad emperor who crowned his horse. Of course, the monks didn't tell it like Suetonius did. They couldn't resist adding a moral spin. To them, Caligula wasn't a clever satirist mocking the Senate. He was a warning from God, a parable about pride and blasphemy. The man who mocked creation by honoring an animal and paid for it with his soul. One 11th century manuscript from Cluny Abbey even claimed that Caligula had bowed before the beast as before the divine. Dramatic, yes. Inaccurate, definitely. But medieval minds loved that stuff. It made a better sermon. What they didn't realize, of course, was that their own kings were quietly reenacting the same theater. The coronations, the divine titles, the chosen by heaven speeches. You didn't need to crown a horse to be absurd. All you needed was a crown. Let's drift to France, around the 13th century. In the royal stables of Paris, a rumor circulated that the Capetian kings kept a white stallion descended from Caligula's Incitatus. The stable boys called him Le Cheval de César, Caesar's horse. Of course, it was probably just some well-bred Andalusian with a good PR story, but that didn't stop the legend. Knights swore that whenever the stallion was ridden into a tournament, its presence brought victory, unless the rider was corrupt, in which case it threw him straight into the mud. You can imagine how popular that little detail was among superstitious nobles. So yes, by the 1200s, Caligula's horse had gone from political satire to divine judge of morality, a cosmic referee in hoofed form. And honestly, that feels like the perfect medieval twist. Meanwhile, in Italy, scholars rediscovering Roman texts during the early Renaissance began to see Caligula in a new light. They weren't monks anymore. They were humanists, people who actually liked thinking. They read Suetonius and Tacitus and thought, wait a minute, maybe he wasn't crazy, maybe he was just bored. They saw the emperor not as a villain, but as an artist of irony, the man who turned politics into performance art. And suddenly, the story of the horse became something else entirely, a metaphor for power's emptiness. An emperor so disgusted with corruption that he crowned a beast just to make a point. Painters in Florence and Venice loved the image. They began depicting it not as madness, but as theater. Caligula in a flowing purple robe, placing a laurel wreath on a calm, indifferent stallion. A golden satire wrapped in silk. You can almost hear the brush strokes whispering, who's really the fool here? By the 1500s, the story had made its way into political philosophy. Machiavelli, though he never mentioned Caligula directly, wrote lines that might as well have been inspired by him. A prince must learn to seem wise, for men judge more by the eye than the heart. Sound familiar? That's Caligula's whole career in a sentence. He didn't become mad, he played mad. Because madness, as it turns out, is a pretty effective costume for truth. And then there's the irony. By mocking the Senate through his horse, Caligula became the one thing emperors feared most: honest. Let's float across time again, to the 18th century, when Europe rediscovered Rome in marble and myth. Writers in candlelit salons adored Caligula. He was dramatic, poetic, and most importantly, dead, which made him safe to admire. Philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot quoted his story as proof that power corrupts, and that sometimes the only sane man in a mad world is the one everyone calls insane. In 1779, a French playwright even staged Incitatus, ou Le Cheval Consul, a satirical play where the horse becomes wiser than every senator combined. The audience loved it, because nothing had changed. 2,000 years later, they were still laughing at the same joke. Different governments, same stupidity. But here's where things take a quietly beautiful turn. By the 19th century, Caligula's horse had stopped being just a punchline. Writers started seeing him as a symbol of innocence, the only pure soul in a rotten empire. Poets imagined Incitatus as a silent observer, watching humanity destroy itself with pride and vanity, a creature that never wanted power, yet carried it with more grace than any emperor. One British historian, Thomas Carlyle, wrote, "If the horse of Caligula could vote, it might vote more wisely than the men who sneer at him." And really, that's the quiet truth sitting at the bottom of this whole story. It's not about cruelty or madness. It's about how absurdity exposes arrogance. Caligula didn't just humiliate his senators, he held up a mirror. And what stared back at them wasn't a horse, it was themselves. Let's end this part with a soft image. Picture it. A lone white horse standing in a ruined marble courtyard, the wind carrying the scent of dust and rosemary. Somewhere, centuries away, a monk is still writing his name. Somewhere, a poet is still rhyming his story. And somewhere, a student is reading about Caligula and smiling, Not because of the madness, but because they recognize the sarcasm. History doesn't forget its best jokes. It just keeps retelling them until they sound like wisdom. And maybe that's all this ever was. A cosmic joke told in Latin, still echoing across time. The emperor who wouldn't die by the 19th century, Caligula, was less a man and more a mood. Historians argued about his sanity. Philosophers used him as shorthand for human arrogance. Artists painted him draped in jewels, staring into the void with a smirk that said, "See, I told you so." But ordinary people, sitting in candlelight, reading penny novels or serialized histories, didn't care about the scholarly debates. They loved the absurdity. A mad emperor crowning his horse? That was pure entertainment, ridiculous, human, and just a little tragic. Like a bedtime story told by civilization itself. And the more time passed, the more people began to suspect that the story wasn't really about Caligula at all. It was about everyone else. The senators who laughed but still showed up for work the next day. The courtiers who toasted to his divine wisdom while trembling behind their cups. The citizens who hated him but adored the spectacle. You know, the audience. The same one that never really changes, no matter what century you're in. By the late 1800s, as Europe industrialized and people began to think they were far too rational for myths, Caligula's story came roaring back in plays, essays, and even political cartoons. He became the perfect metaphor for leadership gone absurd. Newspapers compared every arrogant ruler to him. Every foolish decision was another Incitatus moment. Because no matter the century, people still love watching power make a fool of itself. Writers like Oscar Wilde adored that irony. He once said, "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about." And Caligula, even in death, never had that problem. In literature, he morphed into a tragic philosopher, a man crushed beneath the weight of his own performance. In one French novella, Caligula is portrayed wandering his marble corridors alone, whispering to the ghost of his horse, "They called me mad because I saw them clearly." That line doesn't exist in history, of course, but it feels truer than anything he actually said. Then came Albert Camus, yes, the existentialist one. In 1944, he wrote a play simply titled Caligula. But his version wasn't the cartoon tyrant from Suetonius. He was a thinker, desperate, lonely, suffocating under the absurdity of power. He crowns his horse not out of madness, but out of despair, a desperate act to prove that nothing means anything, that the world's logic is just as ridiculous as a senator bowing to a horse. Audiences were stunned. Caligula, the villain of every textbook, had become a philosopher. The act that once defined insanity had become a cry of nihilism. Camus turned him into the mirror of the 20th century, where every empire still parades its own horses, just with better tailoring. And somewhere, you can imagine the ghost of the emperor grinning. Because 2,000 years later, people were finally getting the joke. Let's float over to another curious corner, the modern historians. By the late 20th century, archaeologists started reassessing Caligula's reign. The discovery of inscriptions, letters, and fragments from his villas suggested that some of his most insane acts were deliberate satire. He wasn't destroying the Roman system, he was exposing it. The Senate hated him because he refused to play their game. He mocked them with open cruelty, yes, but also with genius. When he marched his army to the English Channel and ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war, people thought he'd lost his mind. But modern scholars point out, it was a joke, a staged humiliation of generals who had promised glory but delivered nothing, a performance, not insanity. So when he crowned his horse, it might not have been madness at all. It was the sharpest insult Rome had ever seen, a political punchline so timeless it still lands today. Now imagine that marble stable again, gold trough, purple blankets, servants bowing to a horse that didn't understand why. It's both tragic and absurd, isn't it? Because the horse never asked for any of it. It didn't crave politics or crowns. It just wanted oats, sunlight, and a good run. And yet there it was, trapped in luxury, adored and despised in equal measure. If you tilt your head just a bit, it looks a lot like humanity, always chasing symbols, forgetting the meaning, bowing to the wrong things. That's why the story endures. Not because it's strange, but because it's familiar. We all know an emperor who takes himself too seriously. We've all watched a system pretend that nonsense is wisdom, as long as it wears silk. Caligula didn't invent absurdity, he just pointed at it. In the quiet halls of the Vatican Library, there's a 16th century marginal note beside Suetonius's The 12 Caesars. Written in faded brown ink, it reads, "Perhaps he meant only to mock the pride of men." Whoever wrote that understood something most historians missed. That beneath the cruelty and chaos there was humor, dry, dangerous, prophetic humor. The kind that only truly makes sense centuries later. Because here's the irony. The story of Caligula and his horse outlived the empire, the senators, the coins, and even the language it was told in. The marble crumbled, but the joke survived. And maybe that's the closest thing to immortality Rome ever achieved. Let's end this part on that image. A world that keeps changing its costumes but never its characters. The empire may have fallen, the palaces may be dust, but the laughter still lingers, faint, weary, echoing through every new throne room built since. Because somewhere, every time power bows to absurdity, Caligula's ghost probably leans back, smirks, and whispers, "My horse would have done better." The afterlife of a joke. So, here's the thing about Caligula. He didn't just die. He was reborn, every century in someone else's imagination. No one could quite let him go. The writers, the artists, the gossip mongers of history, they all dragged him back from the grave, polishing his madness, trimming the inconvenient details, and giving him a fresh coat of scandal every few decades. And of course, each version said more about them than about him. During the Renaissance, Caligula became a kind of moral fable. Painters like Rubens and Titian filled grand halls with scenes of decadent Rome, naked senators, overfed emperors, and, in one particularly strange tapestry, a white stallion draped in silk, gazing nobly into the distance. The horse looked serene. The humans looked ridiculous. It was, in its own quiet way, perfect historical justice. Then the Enlightenment came, and philosophers couldn't resist turning Caligula into a case study for reason versus madness. Voltaire called him the man who proved power and logic are incompatible. Diderot imagined him sitting on a golden throne, muttering, "If men pretend to be gods, let a horse be their priest." Was that true? Of course not. But it felt true, which is how history survives when facts fade. And as Europe grew proud of its rational age, Caligula A.S. story became the cautionary tale that polite society told itself after dinner. A soft reminder that intelligence and cruelty often share the same wine glass. By the 19th century, the Victorians were obsessed with him, naturally. They adored moral decay as long as it came with togas and Latin quotes. Every historian wrote their own Caligula. One a monster, one a misunderstood artist, one a tragic poet in a world too rigid for genius. And then there was the horse again, always the horse. Incitatus became a symbol. For some, he represented blind obedience. For others, satire. And for the Romantics, a symbol of misplaced love. A creature adored in a world that didn't understand affection without purpose. Victorian poets loved that kind of stuff. They'd look at a horse in a marble stall and write 3 pages about the loneliness of purity among men. Meanwhile, actual horses probably rolled their eyes, if horses could do that. Let's float over to the 20th century, where things get even stranger. In 1937, an Italian archaeologist named Dr. Rinaldi claimed to have found fragments of what he believed was the real stable of Incitatus. White marble, crushed purple pigment in the dust, and a carved hoofprint. Delicate, deliberate, like a Roman artisan had signed his name with the animal's foot. Of course, scholars argued immediately. Half said it was genuine, the other half said it was a bathhouse. Either way, it proved something important. 2,000 years later, people were still chasing Caligula's ghost. And that's the thing. Every empire needs its ghost stories. Rome's just happens to involve an emperor, a horse, and a joke nobody can stop repeating. In modern times, filmmakers picked up the torch and promptly dropped it into chaos. Every movie about Caligula tried to outdo the last in scandal and spectacle. You know the one. Yes, that one. Infamous not for history, but for how far it missed the point. Because somewhere between the orgies and the violence, they forgot what made the real Caligula terrifying. Not madness, but meaninglessness. He wasn't insane for spectacle's sake. He was reflecting Rome's emptiness, holding up a mirror so cruelly honest that everyone called it madness just to look away. And even in Hollywood's chaos, that truth somehow leaked through the cracks. The more over the top the portrayal, the clearer it became. Maybe Caligula wasn't exaggerating power. Maybe he was just showing it as it truly was. Now here's a curious modern twist. In 2007, a team of French genealogists studying racing horses traced a peculiar bloodline they nicknamed the Imperial Line. It ran through several high-end stables, all the way back, allegedly, to ancient Gaul. Among the records, one breeder in the 17th century had scribbled a note beside his finest stallion, said to descend from Caesar's divine steed, a wild claim, obviously. But historians couldn't resist pointing out the irony. Even if the horse-ass lineage was pure fantasy, people still wanted to believe that somewhere, in the speed of a gallop or the shine of a coat, a piece of Caligula's absurd legend still breathed. And really, maybe that's the truest legacy of all this. Not the cruelty, not the decadence, not even the jokes, but the persistence of belief. The human need to turn mockery into myth, to keep retelling a story because it feels too strange and too familiar to let die. Because let's be honest, every age still has its Caligulas. Every throne still has its favorite, untouchable pet. Just now they're not horses. They're symbols, companies, ideologies, talking points. Different marble, same absurdity. And maybe that's why this story still puts people to sleep. Because somewhere deep down, it's comforting to know that empires have always been ridiculous. In the quiet of night, if you were to walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, past the crumbling walls of what was once Caligula's palace, you might feel that strange dual presence, history and theater blending. The stones remember the cruelty, yes, but also the laughter. And maybe, if you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint clatter of hooves echoing through time. Not galloping, just pacing slowly, proudly, like an emperor's favorite horse waiting for one last ceremony that will never come. And somewhere beyond that silence, you might imagine Caligula's voice, amused, exhausted, eternal, whispering into the wind. You called me mad because I saw you clearly. The kingdom after the laughter. When Caligula was finally gone, stabbed, cornered, and quite poetically betrayed by the same guards who once swore to die for him, Rome didn't celebrate the way you'd expect. There wasn't a grand parade or a cleansing fire of renewal. There was hesitation. Because even after his blood dried on the palace floor, people weren't sure if they should cheer or whisper. He had turned fear into such an art form that even his death felt like a trick. The Senate convened, shaken and humiliated, pretending they had never bowed to him or applauded his speeches about divine horses and living gods. They tried to erase his memory, declaring a damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of his name. All statues of Caligula were to be destroyed, his inscriptions chiseled away, his coins melted. It was the Roman version of, we don't talk about him anymore. And yet, human curiosity is stubborn. You can't erase someone that dramatic. Within a decade, busts of Caligula began to quietly reappear in private homes, not as tributes, but as warnings. Don't let this happen again, they'd say, sipping their wine beneath his marble eyes. Meanwhile, Incitatus, the horse that had somehow become half legend, half punchline, was nowhere to be found. Some whispered that the Praetorian Guard had killed it the night of the assassination, out of superstition. Others claimed the animal was smuggled out by one of Caligula's loyal grooms, taken north to Gaul, and there supposedly it lived the rest of its days in peace, grazing in fields far from Rome's madness. The story goes that, before leaving, the groom carved a small inscription on the stable wall, the only loyal soul he ever had. Nobody ever found that carving, but historians love the idea. Because it makes Caligula feel almost human, a man surrounded by enemies whose only friend was a horse he couldn't explain to anyone else. That's the tragic poetry people crave in their villains. His successor, Claudius, the uncle everyone had once mocked for stuttering and limping, was dragged out from behind a curtain and declared emperor. And the irony? He turned out to be good at it. Steady, cautious, even a little boring. Everything Caligula was not. It's as if Rome collectively decided it had had enough excitement for a century. Claudius rebuilt what Caligula had shattered: laws, order, sanity. But he also quietly kept a few of his nephew's odd traditions: the private games, the elaborate horse races, even the golden troughs. Not because he shared Caligula's madness, but because Romans loved spectacle, and spectacle was currency. They may have loathed the emperor who played God, but they still paid to watch the rerun. Let's drift a little further, a century or so. The empire is now under Nero, who, in typical family fashion, decided to outdo everyone in creative self-destruction. He didn't bother with horses. He preferred stages and liars. But deep down, Nero's narcissism was built on the same foundation that Caligula had poured. The idea that the emperor wasn't just a man, but the performance of a man. And that performance, once started, could never end until it consumed the actor. Historians often wonder if Caligula's madness was contagious, if, by proving that power could mock itself, he gave permission to every ruler after him to try. Because after Caligula, Rome never truly recovered its seriousness. Every emperor that followed carried a hint of theater in his crown. But what about the horse? You'd think he'd vanish entirely from the record, but no. Over time, Incitatus transformed from an animal into an allegory. Poets wrote odes to him, calling him the pure, the silent senator, and, in one rather dramatic verse, the last honest Roman. He became a convenient symbol for all the things humanity projects onto animals: loyalty, innocence, dignity. It's amazing, really. A horse that never spoke somehow said more about power than any emperor could. There's even a medieval legend, probably nonsense, but let us indulge it, that monks in southern France kept a relic they claimed was the hoof of the emperor's horse. A carved bronze horseshoe, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims touching it for luck. No one knows where it went, but local records show donations made to the Church of St. Incitatus. Imagine that, a horse canonized by rumor. History, it seems, never stops making things stranger. Back in the modern world, scholars and psychologists started picking apart Caligula's mind like a dissected tragedy. Was he truly mad, or just performing madness as a form of control? Some argued he was epileptic. Others said schizophrenic. One even claimed he suffered from lead poisoning from Rome's pipes. But honestly, maybe the answer is simpler. Maybe absolute power just gets boring. And when you're surrounded by flatterers, gold, and wine, what else is left to do except terrify everyone and talk to your horse? It's funny how the simplest answer often feels the most human. Even today, whenever a politician, CEO, or influencer goes a bit too far, when power turns theatrical, journalists still dust off the same comparison. Like Caligula, appointing his horse to the Senate. The story survives because it is the perfect shorthand for absurdity, the timeless image of authority so detached from reason that it crowns a creature of instinct. And maybe that's why we still tell it in hushed, amused tones. Because deep down, every empire, old or modern, fears the day when someone will laugh and point and say, "Look, the horse is in charge." In that sense, Caligula never really lost. His name became immortal not through admiration, but through irony. He turned himself into the punchline of eternity, and the world still can't stop repeating the joke. And somewhere in that twisted immortality, there's a kind of victory. After all, who else can claim to have outlived Rome, simply by being ridiculous? So when night falls over the ruins of Rome and the shadows stretch across what used to be marble floors, perhaps you can still imagine the sound of a single horse, calm, steady, unbothered, walking circles around an empty throne. A gentle reminder that power, like everything else, eventually becomes its own parody. The echo that never stopped Caligula's name didn't just linger, it haunted. Every century found a new way to pronounce it. In Latin classrooms, whispered like a warning. In churches, cited as the embodiment of pagan madness. In modern history books, turned into shorthand for the dangers of absolute power. And somehow, Despite being one of Rome's shortest reigning emperors, he became one of its most unforgettable. That in itself is impressive. Terrifying, but impressive. A man who ruled for barely 4 years still lives rent-free in the world's imagination 2 millennia later. No reformer, no conqueror, no saint, just chaos in sandals. It makes you wonder if maybe that's the secret to immortality. Don't be good. Don't even be great. Just be unforgettable. Let's float back for a moment to that palace, to the last night before it all collapsed. Picture it, torches flickering, the smell of myrrh and wine in the air, and a man who once thought himself divine, now pacing the marble floor, speaking softly to a horse. Not shouting, not raving, just talking. Maybe about how people disappointed him. Maybe about how gods didn't answer prayers. Or maybe because he had no one else left who listened. We'll never know what was said, but the image remains. A lonely young emperor and a silent animal, both trapped in a world that expected them to perform perfection. If you strip away the layers of insanity and satire, it's almost tender. Almost. After his death, Rome tried very hard to bury that tenderness. History prefers its villains uncomplicated, easier to label, easier to blame. But behind the scandal of a man who made his horse consul lies something darker and sadder. The loneliness of power. When you can command anyone but trust no one, even a horse starts to look like a friend. It is no coincidence that ancient writers like Suetonius, who told us about Incitatus, also admitted that Caligula grew up watching his family murdered by the state. His mother exiled, his brothers executed. He was raised in palaces that smelled of paranoia, and then, at 24, handed the empire, the biggest stage on earth, and told to act normal. Of course he didn't. Who could? So maybe, when he dressed his horse in purple, it wasn't madness. Maybe it was sarcasm. The ultimate, I dare you to stop me. A pointed jab at senators who pretended to serve Rome, but really served themselves. A kind of performance art, 2,000 years before the term existed. It's a strange comfort to think he might have been in on the joke. Centuries later, philosophers like Albert Camus actually admired that idea. Camus once wrote that Caligula pushed logic to its limit, that his madness was simply an extreme form of clarity. To realize life is meaningless, and to act like it, was, in its own way, honest. Disturbing, yes, but honest. And that's what made Rome hate him. He exposed the absurdity they all lived in. The emperor pretending to be a god, the senators pretending to be virtuous, the citizens pretending it all made sense. And then a horse walks into the Senate, and suddenly, it doesn't. There's a kind of beauty in that collapse. Let's drift now to what's left. Ruins, stories, dust, and irony. In 2021, archaeologists near Lake Nemi uncovered a marble plinth with faint inscriptions they couldn't fully decipher. One line, however, was clear enough to read, "He who mocks the gods becomes their reflection." Was it about Caligula? Maybe. Was it written by him? Probably not, but it fits, almost too perfectly, because his life was a reflection of Rome, of its vanity, of its power pretending to be divine. And when that mirror shattered, everyone tried to blame the reflection instead of the light that made it. It's funny, though. In the 2,000 years since his death, we've built statues of emperors who conquered, legislated, and reformed, and no one remembers half their names. But mention Caligula, and everyone knows. Even if the details blur, the image remains crystal clear. A mad young man in a purple robe, standing beside a horse wearing jewels, laughing in the face of politics. That image has outlived kingdoms, religions, and empires. It's appeared in paintings, operas, films, novels, memes. Yes, even memes. It's absurd and timeless, just like the story itself. Because at the end of the day, every civilization has its breaking point, that moment when power becomes parody. And when it does, someone like Caligula appears. Not to destroy it, but to show it what it's become. So as you lie there, maybe half asleep now, imagine this final scene. The marble halls are empty, the senators are gone, the torches have gone out. All that's left is the faint echo of hooves against stone, slow, steady, rhythmic, almost comforting. Somewhere, in that vast silence of time, a young emperor still whispers to his beloved horse, not as a ruler, not as a god, but as a boy who once believed he could control the world. If men fail me, beasts will rule. A phrase carved into myth, a line that turned from madness to prophecy. And maybe, just maybe, that's what he meant all along. Because history, in its quiet way, keeps proving him right. And that's where we leave him, Caligula, the emperor who blurred the line between satire and sanity, and the horse who somehow became his legacy. Together, they remain the strangest pair in Roman history, and perhaps the most honest. So if you're still awake, take a breath. Let the madness fade. The empire is asleep again, and the horse, finally, can rest. Ever wondered what happens when power meets absurdity? Tonight on Stories Before Sleep, we unravel the unbelievable tale of Caligula, the Roman emperor who crowned his horse Incitatus as a senator. From marble stables and purple robes to political satire that fooled an empire, we explore a story that's as tragic as it is ridiculous. Discover how a boy emperor, a loyal horse, and centuries of legend turned history into one of the funniest and eeriest spectacles Rome ever saw. So dim the lights, get cozy, and drift into the world where emperors are mad, horses are noble, and history whispers the strangest bedtime stories.